Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner. For those of you new to the channel, and I know we've added thousands of new subscribers over the last few weeks, and I'm grateful for that, thank you. I'm a constitutional attorney. I'm a member of the United States Supreme Court Bar. I'm a gun owner myself, and I'm proud to say that in 2021, a federal judge relied in part on my Second Amendment scholarship to rule that California's so-called assault weapon ban was unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. And if you support the Second Amendment, I really would appreciate if you hit the subscribe button. That would be really great. Today at the Four Boxes Diner, we're going to talk about a man who the Ukrainians and their government should have learned from long before they were invaded by the Russians. The most important American, arguably, involving the Second Amendment during our founding period, who fully understood the value of the right to keep and bear arms for preserving human freedom and for preventing foreign invaders and evildoers from taking over our country here in the United States. That man was a man you should have heard about during your schooling, but maybe you did not, because maybe the teacher skipped over this important lesson and this important person in American history. The man's name was Joseph Story. Joseph Story. And the history lessons and the writings of his should have been mandatory reading, not just in the United States, but equally important in the Ukraine. But apparently they were not. Stay tuned and find out why you, as a Second Amendment person in the United States, need to understand the work of Joseph Story and why he's so important to your right to keep and bear arms. We're sitting here today watching the Ukrainian people work overtime to arm themselves and fight the invading Russians. Now, some Ukrainians are even mentioning about how they are basically embracing the United States' Second Amendment tradition and gun culture. Now, my question, of course, is what took you so long? Unfortunately, in my view, you see Ukraine failed to learn the importance of an armed citizenry fast enough. Because I think had they learned it faster, arguably, they might have even been able to thwart the foreign invasion before it occurred, which would have been great. For today's video, I want to teach you about arguably one of the most important men in the founding period who was critical to the early understanding of the Second Amendment and to the understanding of the Second Amendment today by the current U.S. Supreme Court. Okay? Because this man, Joseph Story, who was an early Supreme Court justice, as well as a constitutional scholar, and the first law professor, believe it or not, at Harvard University, he talked repeatedly about the importance of an armed population in deterring tyranny and foreign invaders. Now, you may not have heard about Joseph Story in school, but that's why this channel is here, to try to educate you and your family members and your community on the important issues of the Second Amendment that perhaps the public schools in this country have conveniently, advertently, either intentionally or otherwise, skipped over. But we're here to fill in those gaps for you and for your family and for your colleagues and friends. In 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court decided, as you know, Heller versus the District of Columbia, which said that you and I have an individual right to keep and bear arms. Now, Justice Antonin Scalia wrote the opinion in Heller, as you probably know, and he explained that an armed citizenry, is essential to thwarting governmental tyranny and, more importantly, foreign invaders. I mean, he explains, for example, that the prefatory clause of the Second Amendment, we don't have to forget that at all, right? That's the part of the Second Amendment that says, ready, quote, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Being necessary to the security of a free state. Now, Justice Scalia explained that the phrase free state was not referring to like a particular state like Florida or Texas or Virginia or California, but was instead talking about a free state in its most enlarged, broad sense. Such as, people composing a particular nation or particular community, a state, okay? In other words, the phrase free state refers to citizens or a group of people who've come together to form, let's say, a country. Now, when it comes to the Ukraine, of course, I think the Ukrainians would be considered a free state where their citizens came together to have their own country. That is the state we're talking about. And I think this is very important because in Heller, you see, Justice Scalia lists the reason why the founders thought an armed citizenry was necessary to the security of a free state. Gave really a history lesson in that Heller case. And the first reason that Justice Scalia gives, mission critical for our discussion today about the Ukraine, he writes that having armed citizens is useful in repelling invasions, right? In repelling invasions and suppressing insurrections. Now, an excellent lesson that the Ukrainians are learning as we speak, as I see it. But the question I have is, who did Justice Scalia in 2008 learn this lesson from? Well, it turns out that Justice Scalia, when he wrote Heller, learned the lesson of the importance of the Second Amendment in thwarting tyranny and in repelling foreign invaders from a man named Joseph Story. To begin, Joseph Story was one of the most important and powerful supporters of the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms at the start of our country. You see, Joseph Story became one of the earliest members of the United States Supreme Court, who was appointed at the age of just 32 years of age by the drafter of the Constitution and then President James Madison. That's right. Joseph Story became a Supreme Court justice because the drafter of the U.S. Constitution, James Madison, appointed him to the Supreme Court. Now, you might remember Joseph Story from the decision freeing the African slaves in the Amistad case. That was actually the basis of a movie that Steven Spielberg made about, many years ago. But for our purposes, today, involving the Ukraine and the importance of using guns to thwart foreign invasion, Joseph Story had another view about the importance of human freedom that is very important. You see, it was Joseph Story who explained during America's founding period that America must always have an armed citizenry. In the Heller case, Justice Scalia actually quoted Joseph Story as saying the following, quote, "The militia is the natural defense of a free country." And here's the full quote from Joseph Story. "The militia is the natural defense of a free country against sudden invasions, domestic insurrections, and domestic usurpations of power by rulers." And of course, from other videos, the militia referred to in the Second Amendment is actually drawn from all of us armed citizens, such as you and me. It's very important for you to know who Joseph Story is because his writings and his thoughts on the Second Amendment and why it existed and why it was so important, why the right to keep and bear arms was so important, is important because the U.S. Supreme Court and the justices all look to Joseph Story as historical authoritative proof of what that Second Amendment was designed to address, okay? Because Joseph Story was not only one of the earliest Supreme Court justices, right, during the founding period of our country, he was also the first law professor at Harvard. He also wrote something called the Commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, which were the most important book of the time, discussing the relative, why the Constitution of the United States, what it meant, why it was important, all this stuff, okay? In fact, arguably, Story's work on the Constitution was more important than the Federalist Papers. That's how important they really are. Now, Justice Story's role in protecting our right to keep and bear arms does not just end with the Heller decision. You see, 2 years after the Heller decision, the Supreme Court ruled again on the Second Amendment, saying that the individual right to keep and bear arms applied against states and localities and cities that try to violate that. This was a case you've also probably heard of called McDonald versus Chicago. Now, in that case, Justice Samuel Alito wrote the opinion. And guess who Samuel Alito relies on when he writes his opinion about the importance, the fundamental nature he uses, the word fundamental right to keep and bear arms here in the United States. You guessed it, he talks about Joseph Story again. Now, here is the money line from Justice Story that Sam Alito used. Quote, "The right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic." Now, palladium, folks, is not a word you and I use all the time, right? But it really just means safeguard. So what Joseph Story was saying during our founding period was that if you want to protect all of our liberties as Americans, the right to keep and bear arms is essential. And why is that? Because it, quote, "offers a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers." Joseph Story, back in our founding, added that even if tyrants and invaders are successful in the first instance at, invading us, okay, this right, the right to keep your arms, will enable the people to resist and triumph ultimately over them. Arguably, that's what's happening with the Ukrainians. Even if the Russians were to succeed in their ultimate invasion, conquering of Ukraine, we'll see how that works. Only history will tell. What Joseph Story is teaching is that the Ukrainians will still be able to fight basically an asymmetric war against the Russians in the same way that the Americans used these asymmetrical warfare techniques against the far more powerful British military during the American Revolution. You know what's fascinating as someone that supports the Second Amendment? That is that the anti-gun crowd here in the United States always seems to want to tell us that we should be more like Europe. To them, they claim the Second Amendment is a relic. It's an obstacle to their plans for banning guns here in the country, and we should get rid of the Second Amendment, either through judicial reinterpretation of the text or just by abolishing the text of the Second Amendment, which some people like, the former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens wanted to do. But what's really interesting when they say, let's look to Europe? Why don't we look to Europe now? Isn't it interesting that when a European country, which is what the Ukraine is, faces a foreign invasion, guess what happens? The Ukrainians are following the American example, right? They're basically embracing the right to keep and bear arms by handing out guns to their people and ammunition and trying to teach them the manual of arms. And Ukraine's leaders, again, have basically said, yeah, we're going to give out guns. If you're willing to fight, we'll give you guns, whatever it takes. And I have one final thought on Justice Joseph Story and the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. You see, when politicians say to us today that we need to have further restrictions on our Second Amendment rights to prevent, for example, crime, gun violence, they like to say, which, as you know, is a propaganda term. Here's what Joseph Story had to say about that kind of argument, which I think is quite important, even though he said it, almost 200 years ago. Okay. This is what Story said. Quote, one of the ordinary modes by which tyrants accomplish their purposes without resistance is by disarming the people and making it an offense to keep arms. Now, that was not me. That was not the NRA. That was Joseph Story, really one of the founders of the country and the most important justices in the history of the United States Supreme Court, and one of the important commentators on the meaning of what the Constitution, including the Second Amendment, means for all of us Americans. So let's wrap up. Over in Ukraine, you're seeing a real-world, real-time case study and why the right to keep and bear arms is indispensable. Ukrainians are embracing a tradition of armed self-defense that anti-gunners in our country like to ignore, attack, or make fun of. But this armed citizenry concept is a tradition that you and I need to defend to protect the rest of our liberties as I see it. And if you're looking for a thinker to enlist in our cause, you cannot do a whole lot better than former Justice Joseph Story and his writings in the early 19th century. You see, this great constitutional scholar and Supreme Court justice did a remarkable job shedding light on the importance of an armed citizenry. Remember, the right of the people to keep and bear arms is, quote, the palladium of the liberties of a republic. And if you have any doubts about the importance of an armed citizenry and weapons as a means to protecting civil liberties, civil rights, and human freedom, we need to look no further than the lessons we're seeing today in the Ukraine. I want to sum up this video by one of my favorite quotes from a former federal judge, Alex Kaczynski, which is a quote I think all of you out there who are writing or talking about the Second Amendment should be familiar with. It appeared in a federal judicial opinion. And again, Alex Kaczynski is a former judge in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in California, although he's one of the ones that actually supported the right to keep and bear arms, unlike most of those judges in the Ninth Circuit that generally are always looking for an excuse to justify upholding gun control laws. Now, this is what Judge Kaczynski said in one of his dissents in an important case, which I'll link to down below. Here is his language and not mine, but is very powerful. All too many of the other great tragedies of history, Stalin's atrocities, the killing fields of Cambodia, the Holocaust, to name but a few, were perpetrated by armed troops against unarmed populations. Many could have been avoided or mitigated had the perpetrators known their intended victims were equipped with a rifle and 20 bullets apiece, as the Militia Act required here in the United States. If a few hundred Jewish fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto could hold off the Wehrmacht for almost a month with only a handful of weapons, 6 million Jews armed with rifles could not so easily have been herded into cattle cars. My excellent colleagues have forgotten these bitter lessons of history. The prospect of tyranny may not grab headlines the way vivid stories of gun crime routinely do. But few saw the Third Reich coming until it was too late. The Second Amendment is a doomsday provision, one designed for those exceptionally rare circumstances where all other rights have failed, where the government refuses to stand for re-election and silences those who protest, where courts have lost the courage to oppose or can find no one to enforce their decrees. However improbable these contingencies may seem today, facing them unprepared is a mistake a free people get to make only once. Again, Judge Alex Kaczynski, formerly of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, powerful language on the importance of the Second Amendment, and not just thwarting foreign invaders, but also thwarting government tyranny and evil in all of its forms. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed something here, learned something here at the Four Boxes Diner, and I hope we'll see you again soon. And we'll talk to you soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up.